The news landed like a punch to the gut on a humid Sydney afternoon in May 2026. 66 deaths. 66 lives lost in custody or during police operations across New South Wales in a single year. That's 18 more than the year before. 18 more families shattered, 18 more communities left reeling, grappling with an unbearable question: how could this happen? The official report from the coroner's court was stark, unblinking. It spoke of a record, a grim milestone that nobody wanted to acknowledge, let alone celebrate. It told a story not just of numbers but of systemic failure, of promises unkept, and of a profound, distressing human cost. Imagine the quiet suburb of Plumpton out in Sydney's western reaches, where the houses are solid brick, the gardens are neat, and life moves at a comfortable, if sometimes challenging, pace. That's where Liam, Wally, Wallace called home. Wally wasn't a career criminal. He was a young bloke, 28 years old, with a mischievous grin and a talent for fixing anything with an engine. He'd done a bit of concreting, a bit of landscaping, always chasing the next gig, trying to scrape enough together to help his mum with the bills. He was Indigenous Australian, proud of his heritage and known around the neighbourhood for his generosity, always ready to lend a hand. Like many young men, he'd had his run-ins with the law, minor stuff, mostly a few driving offences, a bit of public mischief. Nothing that suggested his life would end in a concrete cell thousands of kilometres from home in a regional correctional centre near Dubbo. His mum, Auntie Sharon, remembers him as a cheeky kid full of life, always bringing home strays, whether they were broken bikes or actual lost dogs. He'd loved his footy, followed the Rabbitohs religiously, and had a soft spot for his younger sister, always making sure she was all right. Life in Plumpton for the Wallaces was about family, about community, about getting a fair go, just like any other Australian family trying to make ends meet. Wally's story is one of many, a thread in a much larger, more complex tapestry of interactions between individuals and the state. The incident that ultimately led to Wally's death began innocuously enough. A warrant issued for a minor breach of parole, failing to report to his probation officer after a string of casual jobs took him out of Sydney for a few weeks. It was a mistake, a genuine oversight, he'd later tell his lawyer, not an act of deliberate defiance. Police tracked him down to a cousin's place in Redfern. The arrest itself was calm routine. Wally didn't resist. He was processed, then transferred to a correctional centre. This particular centre in regional New South Wales was known for its remote location far from the bustling courtrooms of Sydney. Wally was placed in a cell alone. It was a Friday afternoon when he arrived. The weekend stretched ahead, a long, isolating expanse. He'd requested to call his mum, but the paperwork, the procedures, the bureaucracy of a Friday afternoon in a regional correctional facility meant that call wouldn't happen until Monday. He'd tried to explain his situation, his need to connect with his family, his growing anxiety, but his pleas seemed to disappear into the institutional hum. He was just another number in a system designed for efficiency, not necessarily empathy. On Saturday morning, just past 6:30 a.m., Wally was found unresponsive in his cell. He had taken his own life. The method, as was tragically common, was self-harm by hanging. The very type of death that millions of dollars had supposedly been invested to prevent, to remove the ligature points that made such acts possible. The correctional centre had undergone several upgrades, structural changes intended to make cells safer, to reduce the risk. But for Wally, those changes, those investments had come too late, or had simply not been enough. The alarm bells were already ringing across the state, not just for the individual tragedy of Wally's passing, but for the disturbing pattern it represented. The coroner's court battle that followed Wally's death, and indeed the deaths of the other 65 individuals that year, was not a traditional court battle with an accused and a prosecutor. Instead, it was an inquest, a fact-finding mission, a deep dive into the circumstances surrounding each death. The coroner's role under the Coroner's Act 2009 New South Wales is not to find guilt but to determine the cause of death and, crucially, to make recommendations to prevent similar deaths in the future. Wally's family, represented by lawyers from a community legal centre, became vital participants. They weren't just observers, they were advocates pushing for answers, demanding accountability. They wanted to know why Wally's mental health had seemingly been overlooked, why his requests for family contact hadn't been prioritized, and most critically, why a cell in a modern correctional facility still allowed for such a tragic outcome. Evidence presented included internal correctional service reports, CCTV footage, medical records, and expert testimony on ligature point removal and mental health screening in custody. The family's lawyers highlighted the systemic issues, referencing the long-standing recommendations from previous inquests and royal commissions into Indigenous deaths in custody, recommendations that, despite being in place for decades, seemed to be repeatedly ignored or inadequately implemented. They argued that the correctional centre had a duty of care, a responsibility to ensure Wally's safety and well-being, particularly given his vulnerability and isolation. The state, through its legal representatives, detailed the procedures in place, the training provided to staff, and the efforts made to reduce risks. But the numbers, 66 deaths in a year, spoke a louder, more damning truth. The stakes were immense, not just for Wally's family, who sought some measure of peace and a clearer understanding of their son's final hours, but for every Australian who believed in the principle of a fair go, even for those in the States. Care. What does it say about our society when the very institutions tasked with safeguarding individuals end up presiding over such tragic losses? In the end, the coroner's findings regarding Wally's death, delivered after months of evidence and deliberation, were a sobering echo of the broader report. The coroner acknowledged the profound distress caused to Wally's family and the failures within the system. While no individual was found criminally responsible, the findings pointed to systemic deficiencies in mental health screening, staff training regarding at-risk prisoners, and the ongoing issue of ligature points within cell design despite previous investments. The coroner made a series of strong recommendations. They called for an urgent comprehensive audit of all correctional facilities in New South Wales to ensure all identified ligature points were truly eliminated. They recommended mandatory culturally appropriate mental health training for all correctional officers, with a particular focus on identifying and responding to signs of distress in Indigenous prisoners. Furthermore, the coroner stressed the importance of timely access to family contact for newly admitted prisoners, particularly those from regional or remote communities. For Wally's family, the ruling was a bittersweet victory. It confirmed their deepest fears, that Wally had been failed, but it offered little solace for their loss. They received no monetary compensation, only the hope that Wally's death might prevent others. Justice in this context wasn't about retribution, it was about systemic change, about forcing institutions to truly examine their practices and uphold their duty of care. It was an imperfect outcome, a compromise between the stark reality of what happened and the enduring call for a more humane system. So what does Wally's story and the broader distressing figures of deaths in custody mean for everyday Australians? It means that the state, whether through its police forces or correctional services, has a profound duty of care to every individual in its custody. This isn't a gray area, it's a fundamental principle of our legal system, underpinned